This is another point I just want to talk about very quickly. We often, when we look at data, look at averages. Averages are misleading because what matters is variance. There's a whole field of mathematics in this, and what I'm just going to talk to you about for the last 5 minutes of my talk is why loss aversion and uncertainty aversion may not be a bias, right? It's portrayed by economists as if it's an example of a human bias. The latest in mathematical thinking from the Santa Fe Institute, the London Mathematical Laboratory, people like Murray Gell-Mann, people like Ole Peters, suggest that actually evolution has calibrated our view of risk extremely well. And the reason that economists think it's a bias is not because we're wrong, it's because their maths is wrong. They're using the wrong maths. Now let me just show you a few examples here. We have very strong uncertainty aversion, okay? The great psychological genius of Uber is waiting for a cab was uncertain. When you could watch the car on a map, even though the duration, the SI unit of the wait didn't change, the level of uncertainty was massively reduced, and therefore you were much, much happier, okay? The best bit of advice I gave in my marketing life was to say to British Airways, don't ever put delayed on a departure board. Put an estimate like delayed 120 minutes. We can cope with that. We can't cope with delayed. The best thing London Transport did to improve passenger satisfaction per pound spent wasn't faster, more frequent trains. It was dot matrix displays on the platforms, which we'd rather wait 9 minutes for a train knowing it's coming in 9 minutes than wait 5 minutes for a train in a state of not knowing. We are really, really averse to uncertainty. Here's probably why, right? Now, I want you to imagine a bet. And we've got 4 people taking this bet, and it's a bet where you put all your money into a table. Every time you throw heads, your money goes up by 50%. Every time you throw tails, your money goes down by 40%, okay? Now, most of you will look at that as if the time series expectation is the same as the ensemble average. Right? And you look at that and think, that's a pretty good bet because, look, okay, on average, I'm going to be 5% better off every time I toss that coin. Up 50, down 40, 50% chance of each, 5% gain. 4 people do it, right? Let's get 4 people to do that with £100 each, okay? The 2 guys with heads have 150, the 2 guys with tails have 60, okay? Add them all together, that's £420. Divide that by 4, that's £105. That's a 5% gain. And you go, it's a good bet. In fact, toss the coin as frequently and as fast as you can. I'm off to the Bahamas with the winnings. Okay? Seems logical, right? 5% on average gain every time for the collective. What happens when you do it one more time? This is what happens. One guy is loaded. He throws heads twice. 3 of the 4 people are poorer than when they started. 2 of them have 90, okay? The heads, tails, and tails, heads guys are down to £90. And the tails, tails guys is seriously stuffed. He's got 36. In fact, that guy now needs to throw 3 heads in a row just to get back his initial stake. What this means is that if you think about it, evolution has not calibrated us to be an individual who inhabits parallel universes and enjoys the ensemble gain from 20 people taking a bet all at once. Evolution has optimized us for a world where we have the consequences in a path-dependent world where if you have a lot of misfortune close on its heels, it can wipe you out, okay? And so the fact that we're actually more loss-averse than economics thinks we should be is not because humans are wrong, it's because economists are wrong. And if you think about it, okay, let's take, Nassim Taleb makes this point. You know, it's considered an obvious bias by economists that you'd cross town to save £5 on a clock radio that costs $45 or $10 on a clock radio, but you wouldn't cross town to save $10 on a television. Well, as Nassim makes the point, you make $40 purchases 1,000 times in your life. You only make a television scale purchase once or twice a year. Being more price sensitive in those decisions we take more frequently makes more sense if you look at it spread over time. There's a wonderful case in point, by the way. There's a man in England called Francis fucking Fulford. That's not his real name. He's called Francis fucking Fulford because he's very, very sweary. And he was in the army for a long time, okay? And Francis fucking Fulford lives on 2,000 acres of land in Devon, which was granted to his something like 20 times great-grandfather by Richard I in about 1260 or 1240 or something like that. So it's the longest patch of land in Europe continually occupied by one family. And they asked him, how do you think you've managed to do this? How have you managed to hold on to the same 2,000 acres and a house, although the house has been replaced, for 840 years? And he points up at the ancestors and he says, if I look back at all my ancestors, he said, I've had very sweary man, not me, okay, him. He said, I've had some absolutely terrible fuckers. He had gambling fuckers, alcoholic fuckers, lunatic fuckers, South Sea bubble fuckers. I've had every conceivable disastrous ancestor you can imagine, he said, but we've never had two fuckers in a row. And our loss aversion is not calibrated for a decision we take once and walk away. Our loss aversion is calibrated for decisions, for things we have to do quite a lot. And so the way in which we experience fear is actually less irrational than you may think. Now, this is all in the topic of ergodicity. Basically, real life is not ergodic, by which I mean the expectation series outcome is not the same as the ensemble outcome. And mathematicians tend to assume the two are the same. They're not. Okay? What happens to you over time with one gamble is totally different to what happens to an average of people who take the gamble once. If you want a really extreme example, okay, if I offered all of you $10 million to play Russian roulette once, one or two of you might say yes, okay? But nobody would take any amount of money to play Russian roulette 50 times in a row, okay? You know, on average, 1 in 8 people gets killed. Over time, everybody gets killed. That's why loss aversion, interestingly, may not be a bias. Now, what emerges from this, very quickly, there's a thing which is called bias-variance trade-off. And in a lot of decisions, you have to decide, do I want a bit of bias, but lower variance, or do I want a bit of variance, but lower bias? We're generally happy to cope with a bit of bias to minimize variance. Because, look at this, okay? Under multiplicative dynamics, 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 is a bigger number than 3 times 1 times 3 times 1 times 3 times 1, right? If I'm right, 2, 4, 8, 16, 30, 64 versus 27. If you're adding those things up, they're exactly the same, okay? But 1 times 7 is not the same as 7 times 1 because one person doing something 7 times isn't the same as 7 people doing something once. Okay? Now, if you understand that we're calibrated to reduce variance, lots of things suddenly make sense. Human cooperation makes sense, because if you have 2 people who go hunting and they agree to split the difference, they've got a lower variance food supply, which over time is better than risking starvation just so you can have a few feast days. It explains why McDonald's is the most popular restaurant in the world. Not because it's very, very good. Has anybody read Nassim Taleb's Anti-Fragile? He actually mentions the McDonald's in Milano Centrale Station, saying, why would anybody eat in McDonald's when you're in Milan, including local Milanese? The reason is not that McDonald's is very, very good. It's incredibly good at not being bad, right? If you eat at the Golden Arches, okay, it's not a place you take someone on a date. Obviously, that's Nando's. Okay, right? But McDonald's, if you want to say, I don't want to be ripped off, I don't want to be disappointed, and I don't want to get ill. Do you know what Usain Bolt eats for 2 weeks before he competes in the Olympics? Chicken McNuggets. And Usain Bolt's logic is a low variance logic. He's basically, I'm the best runner in the world, I'm going to win. There are only 2 things I can get wrong, not enough protein and getting ill. If I eat at McDonald's, if I get some fancy bloke in bringing me a load of kale and quinoa, okay, there's a 1 in 10 chance I get the shits. If I go to the Golden Arches, I'm basically safe. Okay? So low variance, what it also explains is social copying. If you do what everybody else does, it's not a bias. If you're in the business of variance reduction, copying other people is a really good way of avoiding doing something terrible, right? Let's imagine you had to move to Jamaica and you thought, which car should I buy? And you only had one question you could ask. Probably the best question is, what's the best-selling car in Jamaica? Might not be perfect for you, but it will be a pretty good car to have in Jamaica, okay? Similarly, habit. I've done it loads of times before. It's always been okay. It's always been somewhere between good and pretty good. Finally, brands. Brands, I would argue, are a variance reduction tactic in the human mind, which is that if I buy a Samsung television, it will cost a bit more than equivalent television from someone I've never heard of, but it's less likely to be terrible. Okay? It'll be somewhere between okay and pretty good, whereas the other television might be somewhere between fantastic value for money and absolute shite. And we will pay a premium to minimize downside risk. Once you understand that, brands are not an example of a bias in human decision-making. They're an example of humans being very, very clever. And this goes back to a conversation which David Ogilvy had in Chicago in about 1950 with a man called Joel Raffleson, who is a copywriter. And Joel, who's still alive, said to David Ogilvy, which I think was the best sentence spoken in an advertising agency in the 20th century, he said, I don't think people choose brand B rather than brand A because they think brand B is better. I think they choose it because they're more certain that it's pretty good. I think that's the most insightful sentence spoken in an advertising agency in 100 years. David, you'll be glad to know, mostly agreed with him. That actually we pay a premium for brands because the likelihood of terribleness is massively reduced when you buy from someone who's got a lot of reputational skin in the game. And finally, very quickly, time's up. Just to repeat, we perceive the world contextually, okay? If you cover up the join there, right, you'll see that the top and bottom of that grey and white thing are both the same shade of grey. Okay? Have we got time for this? Very quickly. Okay, watch this.
At any one moment, we are being bombarded by sensory information. Our brains do a remarkable job of making sense of it all. It seems easy enough to separate the sounds we hear from the sights we see. But there is one illusion that reveals this isn't always the case.
Ba, ba, ba.
Have a look at this. What do you hear?
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba.
But look what happens when we change the picture.
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba. Ba.
And yet, the sound hasn't changed. In every clip, you are only ever hearing ba with a B.
Ba, ba. Ba.
It's an illusion known as the Mcgurk Effect.
Ba.
Take another look.
Ba.
Concentrate first on the right of the screen.
Ba.
Now to the left of the screen.
Ba.
The illusion occurs because what you are seeing clashes with what you are hearing.
In the illusion, what we see overrides what we hear. So the mouth movements we see as we look at a face can actually influence what we believe we're hearing.
So that's one of the most important findings in neuroscience. That actually, how we perceive something, we think we can separate what we hear from what we taste, from what we smell. We can't, okay? Nor can we separate how it feels to close the door of a car with how it feels to close the door of a BMW. That your brand quality in which you invest fundamentally affects your experience of goods that you've bought to which that brand is attached. Moreover, a large part of your perception of anything is driven as much by your memory of that thing as it is by your actual perception of it there and then. And so the fact that perception is not a neat linear mapping of eyes, nose, ears, but instead passes through a black box and then gets, through means we can't quite understand but which we can change, effectively gets transformed into meaning and then gets transformed into emotion, which gets transformed into behavior, seems to me just vitally important. Ask people whether they want their pizza as soon as possible. They all say, yep, I want it as soon as possible. Say, would you prefer it at 8:45 or 8:30? A lot of people go 8:45. How you frame a question affects what people choose. It has a huge effect because if you can get people to wait longer for their pizza, you can put more than one pizza delivery on a single bike. We did that. You could push the delay out to as long as an hour, okay, by framing it as a time of day, not a weight, and by nudging them. Not only could you put 3 pizzas on one bike, in other words, 3 deliveries on one bike, customer satisfaction went up by 50%. We don't fully understand. It's probably uncertainty aversion. Okay? Once you say as soon as possible, you're on tenterhooks wondering when the pizza's going to arrive. If you say 8:45 and it arrives at 8:44, you go, that was a great experience. Now, every single pizza delivery company in the world has spent the last 20 years assuming it's all about speed. It's not. It's all about expectation. Change the expectation, you change the delivery, fundamentally. Finally, there's the Carnot model, that what we care about is not always what economists think we should care about. Does anybody know this? Basically, very quickly, threshold attributes, they don't create much delight, but if you don't have them, your product's rubbish, okay? That's like a milk carton that doesn't leak. No one goes, oh, I love this brand, the cartons don't leak. If your carton does leak, people don't buy the brand after it happens twice, right? Performance attributes tend to be what the product's all about. If you're selling a cassette deck in the 1980s, Carnot's Japanese and worked with Japanese electronics companies at that time, it's sound quality, battery life, build quality, all the things you think people should really care about. Then there are excitement attributes, which are surprisingly peripheral to what the product actually does. Now, in a cassette deck in the 1980s, that was the eject mechanism, right? If you pressed eject and it kind of hissed and whirred with a kind of damping pneumatic mechanism, you thought, what a brilliant cassette deck. If it just went clack, you thought, that's rubbish, I'm not going to buy that. Okay? Now, the important thing about Carnot delight attributes on any product, like the St. Pancras station, which had the longest champagne bar in Europe, okay, is they're surprisingly peripheral to the main function of the thing. The second thing is they're the first thing an accountant kills off when you need to make a cost cutting. The first thing an accountant will get rid of is actually the thing that makes your product delightfully different. This was a case where every single press release about the new station, on which they'd spent about £250 million, mentioned it had the longest champagne bar in Europe. Totally irrelevant boast, okay? Nobody ever goes, I'm thinking of going to a champagne bar. Do you know any long ones, right? Or, I don't go to that champagne bar anymore. It's not long enough, okay? It's bullshit. But that simple bit of human novelty made St. Pancras not merely a utilitarian transit hub, it made it a destination in its own right. Okay? Extraordinary bit of clever PR there by Freud Communications, just to give them the credit. I haven't got time for all of this, except to say the top line is an ad for Hertz. Okay? In every respect, Hertz is more likely to have the car you want, at the location you want, at the price you want. It's got economies of scale. It's more likely to help you out if your car breaks down. If you flip the context to a matter of customer service and human quality rather than something else, flip the context, you turn a weakness into a strength. With the airport bus, I've always hated airport buses. But one day, a pilot on EasyJet, we were coming in, and he said, I've got some bad news and some good news. Now, he waited till we landed. You don't want to hear that at 30,000 feet. He said, the bad news is I won't be able to get you an air bridge because there's a plane blocking the gate. The good news is the bus will take you all the way to passport control, so you won't have far to walk with your bags. And suddenly all of us on the plane went, I'd never thought of it like that before. I now see the bus as a conveyance, not as an inconvenience. I'd always seen it as a low-cost insult to the user of a low-cost airline. Okay? If you actually mention the upside, you can turn a weakness into a strength by just telling a different story about it. Okay? Now, think of the great advertising lines. Reassuringly expensive for Stella Artois. Good things come to those who wait for Guinness. Okay? With a name like Smucker's, we've got to make good jam. Okay? They're all cases of advertising copywriters. Fresh cream cakes, naughty but nice, which was written for Ogilvy by Salman Rushdie. Would you believe it? Okay? They're all examples of copywriting flipping the context so you turn a product weakness into a product strength. And that's what I mean, finally ending up with the importance of context. We can do this in design. If you make a trade-off between standing and sitting on a train, you can design a train where a significant number of people choose to stand. Give people who stand a table to lean against, and don't give people with a seat a table. Everybody who wants to get on with some work on a tablet or a laptop will choose to stand by the window rather than sitting in the middle of the train. So they're asking the wrong question. How can we reduce overcrowding on trains? Why don't you flip that into a behavioral change question and say, how can we make people on trains happy to stand up? Okay? If you change the frame of choice, you change people's happiness with it's called adaptive preference formation, is the name for it. Aesop spotted it with the fable of the fox and the grapes. And finally, this is the big bias you really have to face. That's the last slide, pretty much. Okay? There's a fundamental bias in business decision-making, which is creative people all have to present their wacky, strange, psychological ideas to people far more rational than them. Cost-benefit analysis, feasibility study, all that kind of stuff. That's not wrong, by the way. I think that's a sensible thing. The problem is it never happens the other way around. You never get a bunch of accountants in a room saying, well, I think we've decided this clearly, what we need to do, but before we put it to the board, let's just share our thinking with some wacky people to see if they've got a better idea. That second thing never happens. If you can inject behavioral science and preempt dangerously over-rational decision-making, that's where the biggest value for the discipline really lies, is disrupting people who confidently make decisions because to them, anything that seems logical is therefore necessarily right.